Our cruising guide mentioned that there was a free anchorage at City Island, just east of the Bronx. Unfortunately, there was no apparent way of getting ashore. We took the dinghy to a boatyard, but they didn't know of any public slipways, and they locked their gates every night after work. Using their dock wouldn't work. We visited the local library for maps and help, etc., but they weren't accustomed to receiving tourists, especially those that arrived by boat. We wandered the streets looking for a public landing. One local gent was tending his garden. We got into conversation, and he suggested that the Harlem Yacht Club, just a few blocks away, might be of help. What a fabulous find that turned out to be. We introduced ourselves to Jack, a committee member, who happened to be at the bar at the time, and explained our need for a dinghy dock. Over a drink at the bar, Jack consulted with the Vice Commodore, and they offered us the use of the club mooring for a very reasonable sum. They came over and asked us how much our boat weighed, and we told them 19 tonne, and apparently the available mooring was suitable for our yacht. So they asked how long we were going to stay, and we said about 2 weeks, and they hummed and hawed and said, would $70 be okay? And Keith and I thought that meant $70 a night, which was quite expensive, but okay. It turned out they meant $70 for the whole 2 weeks. Well, we were delighted. The clubhouse was very proud. It's the second yacht club ever established in America, and it's still going strong. And the clubhouse had great facilities, including a lovely lounge area, as well as a really reasonable restaurant, bar, and showers, etc. City Island is about an hour by subway out of downtown New York, and it turned out to be a great base for us to explore the city. The public transport system was great. We took a short bus ride from City Island over to the mainland, and then about an hour on the clean and safe subway that runs through the Bronx and Harlem. And we managed to walk New York. What an exhausting experience.
Central Park was beautiful in the sunshine. There was an exhibition of shoes commemorating the people who had lost their lives in the 9/11 attacks. It was very moving. We went to the Natural History Museum, and I actually quite enjoyed the dioramas. I thought it was an interesting way of exhibiting the creatures and showing the habitat that they lived in. And of course I had to go to Union Station, being a trained person. And we also went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Ground Zero. And being accountants, we had to go to Wall Street and Soho. I'd seen all these TV shows where the buildings all had these external fire escapes, so I found that one interesting. And we went to Little Italy, of course. And being a fan of architecture, I had to go and see the Empire State Building with its magnificent Art Deco architecture. And, of course, the views of New York. We took the ferry over to the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island. The day we went was pretty grey, but we've still found the US immigration side really interesting. Between 1892 and 1954, nearly 12 million new immigrants were processed here. They had an exhibition of the suitcases, and I found it really poignant.
By now, the remnants of Hurricane Francis were due to cross the area, so we postponed our departure. The Harlem Yacht Club carefully checked all the boats were safe on their moorings, and during the height of the storm, the winds were in excess of 40 knots. And the bridle on our mooring parted. That's the 2 pieces of rope that go from the boat down to the mooring. Luckily, we were on board at the time. I quickly started the engine and Keith put out an anchor. But over the course of the next couple of hours, the boat actually began to drag. The holding wasn't fantastic. So we decided to repair the mooring using one of our own bridles. Unfortunately, just as we picked it up, a big wave caused a big surge, and Keith got his hand caught in the cleat. With 19 tonnes of boat pulling on him, this was extremely dangerous and extremely painful. I instinctively began to climb out of the cockpit to go forward to see if I could help, but from the look on his face, I could tell that he was stuck. So I climbed back in and motored forward to take the pressure off, and he managed to free himself. As he stumbled back to the cockpit, he was clutching his hand to his chest, and you could see blood coming down from the glove. And we were both really worried what we'd see under the glove. Luckily, he still had all his fingers, but he'd lost all the flesh off his little finger. There's a photo here which was taken 2 weeks later, and it shows how bad the damage was. But unfortunately, he hadn't actually finished securing the mooring, and the wind was still blowing. So we called up Yacht Club on VHF radio, and they sent their launch to help us. And they wrote some poor unsuspecting guy who'd been having a game of golf and was enjoying a quiet beer at the bar to come and help. And they came over and helped us secure the boat, but they insisted that Keith go to hospital to get it checked. Well, our diagnosis was that there was actually nothing to be done, just wait for the skin to grow. However, they insisted, so off they took him. After several hours, their diagnosis was the same as ours, but it cost several $100s. They suggested some painkillers, but as we knew we had some on board, we just didn't bother and weren't going to pay any more money for that. But the storm force winds were still breaking in the bay, and in those conditions there was still a risk that the new mooring would part or something would go wrong, so I actually had to stay on board the boat. All around there were boats that were breaking free and drifting around, and the Yacht Club launch was busy helping all those. So I actually prepared the navigation to go back out into Long Island Sound and actually motor up and down until the wind eased or Keith came back. Fortunately, although I'd prepared the navigation, I didn't need to use it. The boat held and we were fine. To give the seas a chance to settle down after all the storms and to give Keith a chance to get over the shock and pain of his sore hand, we decided to wait another day before departing New York. Our next obstacle was just around the corner. We left City Island to sail past the Bronx on our way south, and on the way we passed this prison ship. Here's a short video of our passage down Manhattan on the Hudson River through New York.
Part of the route through New York City goes past Roosevelt Island, a narrow islet sitting between Manhattan to the west and Long Island to the east, and linked by the Queensboro Bridge. The passage on the west side of Roosevelt Island was our preferred course. The Queensboro Bridge has a clearance height of 40 metres, enough for us to pass under. The eastern passage requires the first bridge, which only has 12-metre clearance, to stop all the road traffic and open for the boats. Because of the delays, it turned out that we were trying to leave on September 11, the anniversary of the destruction of the World Trade Center. Just as we reached Hell's Gate, a whirling bottleneck at the northern entrance to the East River, the Coast Guard suddenly announced that all vessels must pass Roosevelt Island using the Eastern Passage. However, when we contacted the bridge tender, he refused to open the bridge in case emergency vehicles needed access. In the meantime, Poco Andante had been joined by more yachts, all of us trying to get through and all calling the Coast Guard and the bridges on VHF radio. Amusingly, the Coast Guard wouldn't respond on the radio. They launched their big rib and, complete with machine gun armed guards, raced around the yachts to talk to us each individually. The area is known as Hell's Gate because of the strong 5 to 6 knot currents and turbulent waters that sweep you through. Most of the yachts were actually struggling to stay under control. Finally, the Coast Guard agreed that they would provide an armed escort for the yachts down the West Passage and told all the yachts to form an orderly line. Well, that was never going to happen. We passed under the Queensboro Bridge and down the East River, enjoying really magnificent views of Manhattan. We passed under the Williamsburg Bridge. We sailed past the Medical College of Cornell University and the Chrysler Building, the Brooklyn Bridge, and it's a double-decker bridge with the train rails on the lower level. We crossed the river and managed to sail past the southern end of Manhattan Island. It was very amusing. When we got to the end of the passage, all the yachts headed off in different directions. We chose to go and have a look at the Statue of Liberty and Ellis Island on the Hudson River, before heading south around Cape May into the Delaware.
It took 2 days and a night at sea to round Cape May to reach the Delaware Bay, where we anchored off a marshy inlet to catch some sleep, and waited for a favourable tide to get through the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal. It cuts off quite a long distance out to sea, and we ended up at the top end of the Chesapeake Bay. These images show us going through the C&D Canal. We motored south towards Annapolis, our next stop, and passed under the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. This is a major dual-span bridge in the US state of Maryland. Spanning the Chesapeake Bay, it connects the state's rural eastern shore and the capital city of Annapolis. The original span opened in 1952, and with a length of 4.3 miles, or 6.9 kilometres, was the world's longest continuous over-water steel structure. The parallel span was added in 1973. The bay is 200 miles long and up to 30 miles wide in parts. It is the largest estuary in the US. The west side is bordered by the mainland states of Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware, and is protected from the east by a long peninsula. As a cruising ground, it's very much revered by American sailors. Although quite shallow in parts, it has many protected anchorages and places to visit. In Annapolis, the bronze Kunta Kinte Alex Memorial is dedicated to the African slaves and their descendants. Alex Haley is the author of Roots. This book tells the story of Kunta Kinte, an 18th century African captured as an adolescent and sold into slavery in the United States. Having read the book and seen the TV series years ago, I found the simple composition very impressive. All around us, vendors were selling t-shirts that described Annapolis as a drinking town with a sailing problem. As it is home to the United States Naval Academy, we figured this explained the t-shirts. The Academy was attractive. White marble buildings resembling a traditional university campus the size of a small town. Each midday, there was a muster of all 4,000-odd midshipmen, including a military band, saluting the colours and marching, a stirring sight. The Academy included a chapel with magnificent stained glass, houses for the officers' accommodation, and a fantastic sports arena. They were also very proud that the first American in space graduated from the Academy in 1945, and they had the actual Freedom 7 landing capsule there. On our way again, we passed through another bridge back into the Chesapeake Bay. A US Navy hospital ship was on its way out, appropriately named Comfort. We had planned to visit some of the more isolated parts of the Chesapeake. Intrigued, our next passage took us about a third of the way down the bay to a small fishing community on Tangier Island. The cruising guide mentions that the forebears of the people on the island spoke Elizabethan English, and their descendants retained the original accent from the West Country. After a long day, we arrived just at dusk and decided to risk the channel into the harbour. The pilot book said it had a depth of about 2.2 metres, and Poco Andante draws 1.9. We got safely inside and laid fore and aft anchors to try and keep us inside the channel. The island is also the centre of the blue crab industry and renowned for its crabs. One of the locals, Billy, came alongside and asked if he had a spare beer. We later decided he was the town hophead after he'd offered us marijuana and cocaine, which we declined. It turned out that the island is a dry island, no alcohol allowed, hence the drugs. He stayed on talking in the weird accent for quite some hours and over quite a few beers, but he did eventually leave. But he did return with a bucket of the blue crabs, which Keith enjoyed. Our adventures on Tangier Island weren't over. The next morning we woke to find the wind had come up in the night and changed direction. It had pushed us onto the side of the channel and Poco Andante was aground. High tide wasn't due for another 5 or 6 hours. Keith laid a kedge anchor off to the side to stop us being blown any further aground, and over the next few hours as the tide rose, we gradually winched ourselves into deeper water. It was very embarrassing, and it was a relief to get off the mud. In the end, we were very pleased to get away from Tangier Island. However, in our rush to get away, we hadn't checked the weather forecast. We set off towards Norfolk only to discover that the sea conditions were rapidly deteriorating. We tuned into the weather forecast only to discover that the tail end of Hurricane Ivan, that had done so much damage to the Caribbean, was heading our way. Studying the charts and the cruising guides, we decided to run for shelter on the south side of the Chesapeake Bay. It was still about 25 miles away. During the afternoon, the winds and the seas increased and conditions were increasingly uncomfortable. The dinghy we had salvaged in Newport that we were towing came adrift. Good practice for a man overboard. In those conditions, it was actually rather risky, but we finally managed to secure it again and continue on our way. We entered the Rappahannock River with conditions still pretty rough and lightning on the horizon. Keith was hand steering against the wind, the seas and the current. Finally, we rounded Carotterman Point into a smaller inlet, which we hoped would provide a safe haven for us to ride out the storms. What we hadn't realised from looking at the one-dimensional charts was that the area was as flat as a pancake, one of the disadvantages of marine charts. And Poco Andante was the tallest thing around. Within an hour, the most amazing electrical storm passed overhead. One bolt of lightning hit just close to the shore. The thunderclap was deafening. We disconnected every electrical item that we had, and we battened down the hatches against the driving rain and prayed. We were pleased with our decision to choose this particular anchorage. The bottom was mud with good holding, and there was plenty of room for us to put out all our chain. We waited here for 2 days for the last of the Hurricane Ivan to pass. It certainly made us appreciate being out of the tropics. We'd hate to experience the full force of the hurricanes and tropical storms that seemed to be galloping across the Caribbean that year. Our good friends Doug and Shirley were flying from the UK to Miami on the 10th of October for their silver wedding anniversary, and they were planning to cruise with us. We needed to get our skates on. Our plan was to take the Intracoastal Waterway for some of the way, starting at Portsmouth, Virginia. The ICW is an inshore passage that runs all the way from Norfolk to Miami in Florida. Hampton Roads in Norfolk, was on the southern side of the Chesapeake Bay, is a huge naval base with aircraft carriers, submarines, and a vast array of other naval vessels lining the quaysides. Just as we were motoring past the naval base, our DSC, VHF radio, that's digital selective calling, it came to life and sounded a loud alarm indicating a mayday call. It's every mariner's duty to monitor the emergency channel 16 and respond in the event of a mayday. DSC actually broadcasts the position and identity of the vessel in distress. While I was retrieving the information and writing down the details, the Coast Guard sent out a request to any vessel that had heard the mayday to report to them. So I got on the VHF radio on channel 16 and called them up and identified myself and advised them of the details of the vessel in distress, including its name and position by latitude and longitude. After a pregnant pause, the Coast Guard asked for the information again. They then asked for our position and, reverting to type, asked for the height of our mast. It was apparent that they were unsure how DSC were operated, and they were still using the triangulation method to determine the position of the vessel in distress. I never heard anything more from the Coast Guard about the incident, and just hopefully that these days the US Coast Guard have caught up with the new technology. Portsmouth is the start of the ICW. We spent a couple of days here just unwinding and sightseeing prior to our mad dash south. Hurricane Jean was still a threat, so we timed our trip to hopefully miss her. The ICW is a huge canal. It's over 1,000 miles long, stretches from Norfolk to Miami, and then a further 150 miles to Key West. The ditch, as it's called, was supposedly dredged to at least 9 feet or 3 meters deep. But there was an argument happening between the Corps of Engineers, who are the military, and the individual states as to who was responsible for keeping it dredged. In the meantime, it was silting up. And it was silting up so badly that at places it was only 3 or 4 feet deep. And there was very little help from the tides that came in through the openings to actually sweep it out and clear it. With our 2-metre or 7-foot draft, we were very limited where Poco Andante could go. The other deciding factor is the height of bridges. Although nominally 65 foot high, closer to Florida, this has been forgotten by modern bridge builders. When Poco Andante was out of the water in Rhode Island, we had carefully measured the height of the mast, and we calculated that it was 57 feet, plus about 1.5 feet for aerials, which we hoped were flexible. We had to operate in feet because all the Americans' stuff was happening in feet. The cruising books advised that you could only count on doing about 50 miles a day due to the bridge openings and difficulty in night navigation. This is a vertical drawbridge, and you can just see the difference in height as it goes up. Our first taste was a short trip of 12 miles just around the bend to Great Bridge. We'd been told this was a good place to reprovision for food and drinks. We tied up to the bank alongside a picnic and barbecue site. It was only a short walk to the local supermarket, so we decided to stock up on essentials, wine and beer, plus a little food and some hardware. The US hospitality continued in earnest. After inquiring about borrowing the supermarket trolleys to take our provisions back to the boat, we were offered a lift by the supermarket manager instead. The prices and service were so good that we decided to return for a second load. Much to our embarrassment, the manager recognised us and again offered his services. He was intrigued by our exploits and spent a short time exploring the boat. From Great Bridge, we went to Coinjock through the marshlands of Virginia into North Carolina. Hurricane Jean was getting closer, so we tied up at a small marina there. While generally wandering around and chatting to other crews, we soon found out that a number of the boats had had the same idea and were waiting for the storm to pass, including a 40-metre motor yacht called Norwegian Queen, which was owned by an insurance magnate. Later that day, we were honoured to be invited to a crab bake held by Norwegian Queen for all the boats in the marina. It turned out to be lots of fun, absolute hoot. We had expected to stay in Coinjock for a while, but listening to the forecast indicated that Hurricane Jean was dissipating, so we decided to continue south. From Coinjock, we crossed the Albemarle Sound and passed through the Alligator River Bridge. The bridge is 4.5 kilometres long and provides a swing bridge to allow vessels to pass. A really clever design. You can see the brown colour of the water from the tannin. There are freight barges using the intracoastal waterway, and they take advantage of the calm waters compared with going out to sea, and the freight barges can be enormous. We entered the Alligator River, anchoring for the night in the middle of the North Carolina swamp. It was like being in the middle of a prehistoric film. We were surrounded by tree stumps and seething swamps in every direction. It was a really primordial vista. You could almost feel the coal being made there and then, and half expected to see alligators swim on the boat. I've no idea if there were alligators there, but here's a video of the beautiful area. Now another hurricane was getting closer, so the next day, seeking better protection, we ran up to New Bern, further up the Neuse River. We tied up at the Sheraton Marina next to the hotel of the same name and made use of all their facilities. What a luxury. As the hurricane warning was still in force, we were keen to find out what the marina's procedure was for during the build-up for the hurricane. The marina manager sauntered down to our berth, down our pontoon, and said, "Oh, where are you heading?" We explained that we'd come to seek shelter from hurricane and were heading south. Reassuringly, he told us that Jean had just been downgraded to a tropical storm. Ironically, he then explained that their procedure during a hurricane was actually to take all the boats out of the marina and anchor them in the river, which we'd just come from. Anyway, the winds sort of were strong but manageable, and it was a lot of wind and a lot of rain, but thankfully nothing major. So we hunkered down and with the boat, and then we made some forays into New Bern town. The main claim to fame is the birthplace of Pepsi Cola. It was worth the visit, and there were many pleasant walks and historic buildings, some in the German style. Time was now pressing, and the deadline for getting to Miami was getting closer. Tropical forecasts looked good, no hurricanes on the horizon. We decided to make haste to Charleston, South Carolina, and wait there until the last possible moment before taking the direct route out to sea to Miami. After the weather cleared, we headed for Beaufort, North Carolina, and anchored just inside the spit overnight. Early next morning, we left the brown, swampy waters of the ICW behind and were in the Atlantic again. The 36-hour trip from Beaufort to Charleston was uneventful, with a pleasant sail all the way, and we anchored just off the city for the weekend. Charleston was lovely, lots of interesting walks, but gee, it was hot, damned hot. The locals reckoned that the steam rises out of the ground there, and I can believe it. We walked as far as we could stand, admiring the buildings and noticing the university houses there. They have a very dubious reputation, I understand. It was also time to phone the kids in the UK. Do you remember those days when you had to feed coins into a public call box? This is Keith doing so. On Saturday night, we treated ourselves to Bubba Gump's Shrimp Restaurant, which was the great fun. I even won a prize in the Forrest Gump trivia quiz, presented by a Tom Hanks lookalike. The shrimps were great too. Monday morning soon came, and we set off for our last leg to Miami in light winds and glorious sunshine. As soon as we got offshore, the humidity dropped and the weather was really lovely again. The trip to Miami is over 400 miles and it encounters the Gulf Stream current on the way. And after the second day, the winds rose to about 20-25 knots. So we put a reef in the main and the Genoa, and we sailed south just off Cape Canaveral. When we met the current, it was tall, square waves from every direction, very uncomfortable. During one of the worst bits, the dinghy that we were still towing behind actually flipped over and went off, and it was just too dangerous to go in and retrieve it. Once again, I tried to contact the Coast Guard to warn them that there was this dinghy floating around, but there was no danger of anybody being missing. Once again, I couldn't get hold of the Coast Guard, no response. So our faith in the US Coast Guard sort of dropped even lower. We rounded Cape Canaveral and came inshore. 2 miles off, the sea slackened and the current eased, and we finished the trip to Miami in beautiful 7-8 knots, deep blue sea, and we even got some visits by some dolphins. And we arrived at the Miami Beach Marina with 36 hours to spare, just before Doug and Shirley arrived. It gave me just enough time to clean the boat inside and out, do some laundry, rearrange the storage so they had somewhere to sleep, and to get the lie of the land. And the next day we made it to the airport by bus and were delighted to meet Doug and Shirley, and their flight arrived just as we did. They managed to stay awake until bedtime, courtesy of a walk around the Art Deco area of Miami. Next day we checked out of the marina and headed south towards Key Biscayne. The Florida Keys are really shallow. We found this out the hard way by running aground twice before we found deep water into this little harbour. Our aim was to actually get to the Key Largo by the 13th, which was their wedding anniversary. We had hoped to stop at an intermediate anchorage along the way, but just another grounding in the main channel, we just scuppered that idea. They were direct to Key Largo, but at least we saw a few turtles on the way. Key Largo is actually the start of the Keys proper. It's very disappointing. The whole of the North Keys are just little strips of land, thin strips of land covered with mangrove trees and joined by causeways and bridges, forming US Highway 1. So we anchored close to the bridge, which featured in the Arnie Schwarzenegger film True Lies, which we'd really enjoyed the film. We found Rodriguez Key, but it was too far to the Coral Reef National Park, and the bus transport along the Keys was really hit and miss. However, Doug and Shirley found a nice little resort hotel for their anniversary, and Keith and I actually managed to find a shopping mall and go shopping. I found a really good outlet store and managed to buy new clothes for the entire season. So we were really pleased with that. And I even found a dentist to replace a lost filling. When Doug and Shirley came back to the boat, it was really overcast and rainy, so we hung around another day, and we sort of managed to see the mangrove beaches at close hand. Key West was different from other parts of the US that we'd already visited. Really laid back, and they had a party atmosphere with just a touch of the Caribbean and the Latin in the air. The favourite pastimes were eating out, watching the sunset, pub crawling, and just walking around. We did all of these, including a visit to the local shopping malls. Sadly, after 2 weeks, Doug and Shirley had to leave us and took a shuttle back to Miami Airport. Our time together was all too short. Key West is famous for Jimmy Buffett. He's a singer-songwriter whose music portrays island escapism. You may know some of his songs, Margaritaville, It's 5 O'Clock Somewhere. There are all these people walking around with stuffed parrots on their shoulders and on their hats, and some were wearing pirate costumes. We had no idea why, and we asked a local barman, and he explained that they were parrot heads. Apparently they attend the annual Jimmy Buffett convention. It was great fun, and we actually really enjoyed his music and bought a CD. The week following Doug and Shirley's departure was Fantasy Fest, and it's a week-long party culminating in Halloween. An unbelievable experience and difficult to describe. People of both sexes, all shapes and sizes and ages, strolling through the streets wearing not much at all, although some body paint was sometimes applied to strategic bits of the anatomy. The body painting artists set up business in the shop fronts along Duval Street, where all the action took place, and the process itself was viewed by all the passers-by. Partying started on the Monday, with many of the bars and restaurants holding themed parties and things like toga party, foam party, whore and pimp parties. And it climaxed on the Saturday evening with a formal parade through Key West with about 70 floats. Unfortunately, the hot nature of the photographs in the previous days must have burned out our camera, which promptly died in the middle of the parade. But the whole experience was amazing fun.